Hello, welcome to the EP7 podcast. You are here with Rachel Donovan and the founder of EP7, Mr. George Helou.
Thanks, Rachel, and thank you for joining us. We love talking about how to get the heart into everything we do to get a lot out of life.
Whether it be relationships, business, careers, you name it. So, let's get started. So before we started recording this one, I began to get a little bit anxious.
Yeah, I feel anxious right now, but not too much. I mean, I just breathed a little, but...
Is that because you don't know where this is going to go?
No, that's right. And that's one of our rules, isn't it, Rachel? That once we choose a topic, we connect generally about the important aspects of it that we would definitely want to cover, but we stop pretty quickly and we decide to let it be more free-flowing. And here we are, and what's the topic that we're about to engage?
Well, this was your idea because we just released the podcast, which was about depression. And this one now is a similar, linked to that and has similarities in terms of anxiety, being anxious.
Yeah. I see that those two things, they are part of a cycle. And so this is let me kind of share with you what mulls in my head about these topics when I'm driving and wandering, because, many times I've been a little frustrated that people have been anxious and I'm doing my best to try to help them understand that anxiety. And that anxiety is very persistent. It is one of the hardest things to tame in someone. So this is what I feel happens when people are getting drained because they're very anxious in their everyday life. Like every time they go to do something, every time they go, like social anxiety and, they're trying to succeed at something and they're anxious about failing. But here's the thing. Everybody can have a bit of nerves, butterflies in the stomach, a bit of anticipation. That's not a problem because it makes you focus, right? But high anxiety means you're becoming debilitated, like you're not even able to function the way you should. And then what comes out of that is panic attacks as well. So anxiety attacks, panic attacks, right? So that's very, very draining. Draining when you're on edge all the time. So that what would you want to do, Rachel, if you've had days and maybe even weeks with too much anxiety? Eventually, aren't you over it and don't want to put yourself in any situation where you're anxious anymore?
Yeah.
Aren't you likely to withdraw because you're so exhausted?
Exhausted, drained, can't face it,
And because you're so fed up and now you've become a recluse and now you're unmotivated to get back out there in that world that where you feel so much anxiety, that's depression. Now you're depressed from the world because you're tired of feeling so anxious. Yeah. Okay, so that's the relationship. And then obviously you're going to get bored in the depressed state for too long and people are going to give you a hard time for not being out there partying, working, whatever. So you pull yourself back out there to have the anxiety again. So there's your cycle, right? So let's look at anxiety. Obviously, by definition, you're afraid of consequences that are imminent. Isn't that what anxiety really is? Like you're expecting some serious consequences that are about to happen to you. And it's even physical, like you're expecting some form of punishment, some form of missing out that will be very costly to you emotionally and physically, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. Now, the other thing about anxiety is it's rarely rational. So, in other words, all of us need anxiety if there's a legitimate reason because it puts us into a high-stress state to deal with a threat. But the issue with anxiety is that 99.9% recurring, in other words, very rarely, is the level of physiology where we're highly stressed and anxious. It's actually a legitimate thing that we should be in, because what we end up finding out, Rachel, is that we were anxious for the wrong reasons. Like, it really didn't play out the way we feared.
Yeah,
right?
Of course.
And you can ask anyone who's anxious how many consequences they feared played out the way they feared or even happened. And the answer is no, it didn't.
Yeah.
And then they end up getting frustrated because they know this. Like, they end up realizing this consciously, but they can't help it.
No.
And that's hard. That's pretty hard to be having to live with every day.
Of course.
So,
I mean, there must be different degrees of anxiety.
Yeah, for sure.
Mm.
We probably end up losing the quality of those moments because we are allowing ourselves to be nervous for the wrong reasons, on edge, and not creating the connection that's there to be had. So it's a subtle pulling back and being afraid. And then the brain, the quality of thoughts are diluted, like we're taken away from our flow. So it's almost as if low-level anxiety is very destructive too, because all the love, all the adventure, all the awesome ideas that would come to you if you were more present are gone. However, medium and even high-level anxiety becomes more obvious, doesn't it, to both parties?
Yeah.
And that's where you can't even function properly if you're too highly anxious. And suddenly medication becomes a solution for a lot of people that can't address why they're feeling anxious. They become desperate.
Is it something, if someone's dealing it for a prolonged period of time, that it's almost just becomes they're operating normally under this anxious way, then that's when they turn to doctors and medication. Yeah,
because they're desperate, because they're tired of it, and everything they've tried hasn't worked. So yeah, they need some reprieve. Yeah. So they go the medication way, and I really don't know much about that world and the side effects of that medication, but I do know that it can help.
Yeah.
But I also know some people take natural medication, natural stuff, and they actually say it makes a difference to them. So there's no real side effects from that. And so those solutions have to be on offer, just like antidepressants can be a very important solution for someone who's desperate. I think anxiety medication would also be helpful in that way. But you and I should be discussing, how can we not need it?
Yeah, of course.
Because we were saying off air that our ongoing assumption between us in all our podcasts is that every individual has the beauty of design within them that emulates nature, which means while we have challenges in whatever genetic expressions going on in us, where we have disabilities in some way, the power of who we really are can turn on and off genetic expression, which means when we're passionate to evolve and be more adapted to the challenges of our environment and more equipped to handle anything, that shows us that we're a lot more malleable than we're raised to identify with. So you and I are always coming from a place of, where can we go deep enough in us, and where can we go to a truth where we can be different, where we can find that we're assuming things that are not true, and it's thrown us out of balance. It's replaced love with fear. It's made opportunities invisible, that therefore our perception is distorted. We're self-deceived, and that prolonged becomes a torture, a trauma, that eventually the brain wires into thinking that's the way the world is, and we stay stuck that way.
Okay.
I mean, isn't that really, it's a huge premise for us in our conversations that we lean towards that theory, don't we? That we are beautiful people. Now, it doesn't mean we'll find the solutions. It doesn't mean through the processes that we'll actually get the outcome of being set free. And therefore, anyone could be listening to our conversations, and it might be helpful, but it might not always be helpful. Some things may push them too far, too quick, that they're desperate and whatever they're trying is not working. So therefore they have to have some medication just to give them some sense of stability when they need it most.
Yeah.
And good on them for taking whatever actions they need for them whenever they need it. But obviously our job in our full context of the empowerment of an individual is how much more information, tools, and us role-playing and playing out practical situations where we can be different can we offer in our ongoing conversations that would allow our beautiful listeners to be fed options.
Yeah.
You know, a toolbox full of tools. So it's not just a hammer, you know, and we're trying to hammer in a screw and it's not working.
Yeah.
The more tools we give, then one of hundreds of tools is medication.
Yeah, of course.
That's really our passion, isn't it, Rachel?
Yeah.
It's to give as many tools as possible. And I think it's important for us to cover this off just so that when people listen, they know where we stand and they know that whatever their choices are at the end of the day, they're making those choices based on as much information as possible for them to be informed. Yeah?
Yeah. Well, because I remember there's been a couple of periods, I mean, I haven't suffered from anxiety for long periods of time, but there's been a couple of points in my life where I was under a lot of stress or some things had happened that sent me into a period of time where I was so anxious.
Highly anxious.
Got you. And it was really awful. I'd go from zero or feeling zero to all of a sudden if I hit some traffic and I thought I was going to be late for something, I was just 100 with panic and with feeling sick in the stomach and it was really, really awful. I was just like the feeling of it, like the physical feeling of it as well. But it was just, and it felt at those times, it almost felt just uncontrollable. Like I couldn't reason to realize it's just some traffic, just call it, I didn't call them, but it still would have, I just still couldn't let go of those high stress feelings of anxiety. And it was a work in progress in terms of I could see clearly, and I was aware that I was anxious. I wasn't in denial of it, but I was a work in progress to work down over a period of time to relieve myself of those feelings.
What are the things you were doing that were helping you address that?
Meditating helped, with breathing.
Yeah?
Yoga.
Yeah. Yeah, you did yoga. And when you were deep breathing, did you literally notice it was hard to do, but it was something physiological that you could hold on to? And if you just stayed with it, eventually it would send different signals to your brain to say, hey, turns out the environment's pretty cool. We can just chill out. And then the brain, gullible, is just as likely to believe a jungle when there's a resort with a cocktail bar there instead. So, if the brain's that gullible, it'll believe anything. We may as well deceive it into the truth. Yeah. Ironic to say.
Yeah. Well, it was like because everything was so, I felt like I was on, everything was the speed, like everything was just frantic and there was so much to do and I was just always sort of, my brain was just buzzing 100 miles an hour. So it was almost like breathing and yoga. I just go extra slowly. It was like I was just trying to change my brain instead of going at 100 miles an hour and I couldn't sleep and I couldn't think, to really start to put the brakes on and put everything in slow motion, one thing at a time, and just try to almost reset the way I was thinking out of my panic modes, out of the stressful times I've been through.
Sure. And look, a lot of things can contribute to anxiety. Toxic relationships is up there with the best of them. But also, if you feel vulnerable, but from sleep deprivation, malnutrition, just sheer exhaustion, being stretched and overwhelmed, then you're just creating the perfect storm for the brain to eventually snap into anxiety. So it really is, sometimes it's a lot of elements, so searching for the one is not necessarily relevant. But in a perfect storm, your worst insecurities will be magnified. So if you created an acidic environment, then your worst fears are going to play out for you because suddenly you're being pushed that far. But if things are pretty cruisy, then your worst fears aren't being tested. So there are two parts to this for me. It's create an environment that would put you at peace and relax you, but then also address the cracks in your foundation that can be exploited in the first place.
What do you mean by that?
Well, okay. I was saying this off air to you when we were trying to understand where this could go, right? So when you look at emotions, rarely is there one emotion on its own, right? There's emotion clusters. They all interconnect together. And so if anxiety is the dominant one, you can bet that there'll be a lot of very relevant emotions that tell a story. And emotion, like in the past I said, energy, motion. Energy is being directed into a specific motion. So aggressive motion is the emotion of anger, right? So can you see how emotion eventually translates into physical expression?
Yeah.
Yeah, right? Because it's a chemical journey of a mental assumption that says, this is the world. Now you need to adopt the emotional state that's appropriate and then let the physical state express and respond to that world appropriately. So that means whenever you are anxious, you can honor that it's a cause and effect chain to follow. And so then you are to feel that anxiety and go, I'm feeling anxious because there is a legitimate reason for me. It might not be based on truth, but I'm believing it's truth for now. So what is the truth? And by doing that and allowing yourself to just accept that you're anxious for apparently legitimate reasons, you then will breathe into it and honor that emotion. Before you know it, the other emotions come out too. So intimidated. I feel intimidated, or I feel betrayed. You know? See how these other emotions can easily be a part of anxiety?
Yeah.
Okay. When those emotions start to show up, they're telling a tale, because the context of a betrayal links to who betrayed you. Was it a circumstance that appeared like a betrayal? Was it a person who felt justified to betray you for their wrong reasons? Or maybe they had right reasons because you didn't realize you were being passive-aggressive towards them because you felt that was justified. There's a whole journey to unravel there. But when you finally get to the context of what's going on, you can sit with that. And the more you sit with that with more detail, eventually you're informed. And by being informed, you'll know whether it's rational or irrational. And if the brain is given that much information, it will then no longer want to be tricked. Like it's overwhelmed with the relevance of that situation. Mm-hmm. Your anxiety levels, by honoring your emotions, including your anxiety first, will actually improve. Because, you see, most people when they're anxious, they're fighting it. It's like, I don't want to feel anxious. Oh my gosh, I'm going to sweat and embarrass myself now. And oh my gosh, now I'm going to lose it. And I'm shaking and people are going to wonder. And eventually what happens is the anxiety creates anxiety.
Yeah.
More anxiety.
Yeah, onto a panic attack.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so if you say, oh, I'm feeling anxious, I need to honor it. Because I talk about honoring your emotions, right? For at least a minute, because by the time you've honored it that long, the information starts to, allow you to be informed. The information comes out. So if you honor the anxiety, you're not denying yourself anymore. You're not denying your brain. And your brain doesn't go, imagine like this is me trying to personify it, right? Uh-oh, she's in denial. She's in denial, everyone. Quick, ramp up the anxiety. She's not taking us seriously. She thinks that we're full of crap, and it's not true. We know that the world is dangerous right now. We need to be on edge. That's what happens. And you go, no, I can't be anxious. Oh, she's pushing hard. We need to push harder. And that's what happens. You're actually making a brain panic that you're not taking it seriously, and it wants to be taken seriously. It doesn't matter that it's wrong. It doesn't matter that the brain's wrong. So anyway, by you going, oh, it turns out that we have a problem. Tell me more, brain. Then the brain goes, well, it's this, and it's that, and it's this, and it's that, and all this, and that, right? And then the more it talks, and the more you listen, right, I see what's going on. So I believe this and that, and I believe, and eventually, you know what? The story gets weaker and weaker and weaker to be anxious. But the only reason why it got weaker was because you validated your fear first. You actually honored and said, maybe I'm fearful for a reason. Tell me more. Don't you think that's a good idea?
Yeah.
And you know what's interesting, Rachel? Mm-hmm. It plays out the same with other people. If you validate their fear, they calm down.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, you're afraid. Tell me more. What's going on for you? Like, why are you so upset? Why are you so anxious? Oh, well, it's... And the more you're there for that person and you're understanding them, the more they calm down.
So do you think by you doing that to yourself and you say, tell me more, and you start saying whatever the reasons are, and really it's not something, I guess, that's huge, is that what kind of makes you sort of calm down? I guess me, for my example, and I was going to be late because I hit some traffic.
Yeah.
I was going to be 5 minutes late. That was just too much to bear at that time.
Yeah.
So is that the sort of part of the reason that...
Can we play it out?
Yeah.
Like, say you're in the car and you say to yourself, okay, gosh, being 5 minutes late is a disaster because they're going to sack me. They're going to sack me because I deserve it? Because should I call them and tell them, looks like I'm running 5 minutes late and apologize? And then eventually you'll go, should they sack me if I'm 5 minutes late and I've called and I apologize and I haven't been late that often anyway, hardly ever? So what are you going to do with that? What would happen to you, Rachel, if you go, well, I'm really anxious now because being late means what to me?
Yeah, sure.
And you actually have to confront that.
Yeah. And I remember like those feelings as well, really then, because one, it's kind of like opening the Pandora's box. I'm going to be late. I'm unreliable. I shouldn't have let that person keep me. I should listen to myself. I should have left when I said it. And then it's, you start on this kind of, I'm a doormat. You start on this list of reasons, and as you're piling on the frustrations, which just feeds it.
Well, yes, but I think you also asked the question that if you go there, is it going to get worse? Because it's kind of like, oh, why should I feel anxious? Oh my gosh, this is terrible. Like, oh my gosh, the more I think about it, the more I freak out. Like, that's the danger, isn't it, if you go there? So when you're going there, are you validating? Like, are you looking for the truth, or are you looking for reasons to be more anxious? Like, should I really be anxious? Let me validate that. Why should I be anxious? Does that take you down a different path to, oh my gosh, I'm anxious because I should be anxious for all these reasons? Like, that's someone who is obviously got to that high anxious state because they were doing that already, weren't they?
Yeah.
So they've already whipped themselves up into a fear, but it happens so fast that it's not even conscious in the end. Someone caught in a highly anxious state for a long time, this is what we're talking about. You know how you said it accelerated so quickly, you didn't even have a conscious journey to warrant that level of anxiety. And I think this is the problem with anxiety. At its worst, like for all of us, it would be you don't even have rational journey there. And therefore, you've been hijacked with no reasoning, no discussion, no ability to negotiate anything. You've just been taken to a state of unbearable struggle on edge, and you don't know how to turn it off because there's no levers, there's no ability to do anything about it. That's why we're having this podcast, because we're trying to explore when you're that desperate, what can you do? And I think the deep breathing is definitely a common one that you hear a lot. Like, breathe deeply. You know, the paper bag is a discipline of visually seeing it's been blown up and blown down, but you don't need that. You can just, right? But also while you're breathing and you do it long enough for the signals to hit the brain to go, oh, it turns out it's not that bad. what do you do with your thoughts after that breathing to help you off it? And when you do get off it, what do you do so that you're not triggered into that highly anxious state again? And I think that's where we need to bridge the gap between the conscious and subconscious again, because your subconscious is wired to be triggered so easily to throw you in a highly anxious state. If you don't address that, then you will continue to need coping mechanisms to put out the fire without going to the gas leak. And you have to go to the gas leak, because every now and then circumstances will spark something and turn on the fire.
Yeah.
That's life.
Yeah.
You know, circumstances will always spark something, the brain will associate something, and then boom, it's back on again. So I reckon if you really want to address high anxiety, you have to go with that whole thing that we talk about in the past with personal assessment work. So we talk about that in EP7. You've got to go 5 whys deep into root causes. And so you know what your actions are when you're anxious. You know your emotions are obviously anxiety and then the other emotions that interconnect. And then you finally honor all the thinking that's going on that makes you feel that way and act that way. And then you go, well, what must I believe for me to think, feel, and act this way? And if you can see how disrespectful these beliefs are to you, how cruel they are to you, how illogical they are, absurd they are, but they can't be opinions. You know, you can't have someone saying to you, there's no need to be anxious. There's no need to be anxious. Look, nothing's going on. That's an opinion. The brain goes, shut up. That's just an anomaly. I'm laughing because you're laughing, man.
Shut up.
Shut up.
It's true, though. It's so true.
Yeah. So you have to load credible, rich information to overwhelm that brain. You've heard me say this a lot, right? Because it's one of the fundamental pillars of everything that I do in EP7 and neuroscience, you know, understanding how a brain changes, making something very relevant shocks it, and choreographing repetition helps it shift too. So you have to get into the depth of cause and effect of think, feel, act, and why you believe that, where it came from. And from that, you're going to go, wow, life is very different than what I thought it was. And then you look at your world and it's almost as if the lens that the world is that dangerous is removed and you see more playground and more beauty. And now when something goes to trigger you, because you were shocked out of that trigger, you experience it very differently for the first time. And that's a beautiful thing because you've realized only how far you've come when you've had those tests in your life.
Yeah.
So anxiety is there for a reason. Honor it. Don't treat it like a disorder without a journey of a brain reacting because it believes something that is not true most of the time. So therefore, track it down to the deception where the brain's being wired to assume things are not true. Track it down. Because if you don't, then you'll forever be held hostage by this paranoid part of our belief system that pushes us into overprotection in that anxious state when really the opportunity is there for us to continue to thrive. That's been taken away from us as a result, right? But anyway, so that's my best crack at anxiety, trying to fit it into the bigger picture of what's going on for us.
Yeah. Well, it's a good one to be discussing because we don't want it to have it prolong. It's an awful feeling to experience it and little ways to address it and to work on it and, you know, in between to resolve it. Because I look back now and I think, wow, this point is awful, but it can be done. It can be resolved completely. So
well, you did it.
Absolutely, yeah.
And I know a lot of people that have done it. So it's very doable.
Yeah.
But you have to commit to going within yourself and undoing anything that's causing it. And there's a discipline in that. There's a passion and a willpower to want that. But the rewards are priceless.
Yeah.
waiting for you on the other side of that. And while medication might be short term, you know, if you can avoid it, fine. But if you feel you need it, fine. But at least still go there and address the triggers and start to undo them.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, thanks, George. Thanks for chatting about anxiety with us today.
Yeah, I'm not feeling that anxious anymore.
No.
I'm pretty chilled out now that it's over. It's all good.
All right. Well,
thank you.
Look forward to talking to you soon.
All right. Bye for now.
Thank you for joining us on another EP7 podcast. If you liked what you heard, remember to share and subscribe so you're notified of every podcast released. If you have any questions or would like to connect with us, please jump on the EP7 official Facebook page. We'd love to hear from you.